The real meaning of Buddhism revealed by scientific advances and its future significance to humanity. Although Buddhism has been thought to be enigmatic, extremely difficult to understand, and in many respects incomprehensible, advances in science are beginning to unravel many of its mysteries. Every time the latest science unravels the mysteries of the quantum and cosmos, it confirms the meaning and validity of Buddhist teachings that have been preached for 2,500 years. This series of videos is based on the latest scientific findings and attempts to unravel the mysteries of the core of Buddhism, which have been considered unexplained until now, and to show that Buddhism is not simply an oriental religion, but rather a source of wisdom that is extremely useful for all humankind. What is Buddhism? Introduction. Buddhism often appears as an enigmatic Eastern religion, its true purpose and ideas shrouded in mystery. The complexity arises partly from the diversity of Buddhist sects and their varied practices, making it challenging to grasp the underlying essence that unites them all. However, the difficulty in comprehending Buddhism extends beyond sectarian differences. Even fundamental Buddhist doctrines, such as the Middle Way, the 12 dependent originations, and the concept of suffering, have been expounded in numerous commentaries, yet they remain elusive to many. Why does Buddhist thinking prove so elusive? The answer lies in the stark contrast between the Buddhist worldview and our everyday perspective. Typically, we adhere to naive realism, assuming that everyone perceives the same external world. Buddhism, however, asserts that the physical world is intertwined with our mental realm. Consider the 12 dependent originations, which describe causal links leading to suffering. Most of these events occur within the mind, while the visible physical world represents only a fraction of reality. By limiting our understanding to the tangible, we overlook the significance of these invisible mental processes. This divergence in worldview has hindered a proper grasp of Buddhist thought. Remarkably, advances in quantum mechanics since the first half of the 20th century have shed light on the role of human consciousness in determining the state of subatomic particles. This discovery challenged the traditional view of the material world as fixed and independent of human existence. Naive realism, which assumes that everyone perceives the same world, is already becoming a thing of the past, especially in cutting-edge quantum physics and cosmology. It is now understood that the real world is not predetermined, but is selected from a myriad of potential states. And it is believed that human consciousness may actively influence this selection process. Strikingly, such a scientific worldview aligns closely with Buddhism's original perspective. The conventional explanation of Buddhism based on naive realism has obscured the true depth and scientific relevance of Buddhism, just as the outdated celestial motion theory explains the motion of the planets. To address this problem, this series first delves into the Buddhist worldview. It then elucidates Buddhist thought and makes complex ideas easier to understand. Ultimately, I emphasize that Buddhist thinking is profoundly scientific and universally beneficial. Regardless of ideology or belief, it offers insights for a better life, transcending cultural and geographical boundaries. My goal is to unravel the wisdom of Buddhist thought, allowing you to discover answers to life's myriad questions firsthand. What is Buddhism? The Basics, Part 1. This series aims to elucidate the essence of Buddhism for those curious about its principles. However, it diverges from traditional introductory Buddhist texts, avoiding dense explanations laden with technical jargon that can be daunting for newcomers. The challenge with many introductory Buddhist texts lies in their use of traditional Buddhist terminology without providing accessible explanations. This approach stems from the difficulty in simplifying these terms without compromising their essence, which necessitates a profound understanding of the Buddhist worldview. Authors of introductory Buddhist literature often strive to align their explanations with the common naive realist worldview, prevalent among most readers. However, this endeavor often dilutes the true significance of Buddhist ideas and concepts, rendering them peculiar and less meaningful. Given the radical disparity between the Buddhist worldview and naive realism, grasping Buddhist ideas and concepts becomes nearly impossible without first comprehending the Buddhist worldview itself. In this series, I will begin by elucidating the Buddhist worldview before delving into the interpretation of its ideas and practices in subsequent discussions. By laying this foundational understanding, I can navigate the intricacies of Buddhism with clarity and insight. What is Buddhism? Basics Part 2. What is enlightenment? Buddhism, as its name suggests, revolves around the teachings of the Buddha. Hence, to grasp the essence of Buddhism, it's crucial to understand who the Buddha was. The individual who propagated Buddhism is known as Shakyamuni Buddha, born Gautama Siddhartha approximately 2,500 years ago in the region near the present-day border of India and Nepal, into the Sakya tribe's royal lineage. Despite his privileged upbringing, Siddhartha grappled with profound existential questions concerning the nature of life. He pondered why beings in the world perpetually engaged in conflict and why suffering seemed inherent to existence. His aspiration was for all beings to coexist harmoniously, free from sorrow and strife. But as he took a closer look at reality, he encountered a world full of survival struggles and suffering. Driven by an intense quest for answers, Siddhartha renounced his princely status, departed his palace, and embarked on a spiritual journey. He explored various practices aimed at maximizing the human mind's potential, including rigorous asceticism involving extreme physical hardship. However, Siddhartha realized that such practices failed to yield the insights he sought. His physical and mental turmoil obstructed his perception of reality's true nature. Subsequently, he discovered a path leading to optimal physical and mental equilibrium, forsaking extreme asceticism. In this balanced state, he delved into his inner world, ultimately uncovering the answers to his existential inquiries, the essence of life and being. Thus, Siddhartha attained enlightenment, becoming a Buddha, a term signifying one who has awakened to the true nature of all things. What distinguishes ordinary individuals from a Buddha? While ordinary people may experience fleeting moments of realization akin to an aha experience, these insights dissipate amidst the tumult of everyday thoughts. A Buddha, however, maintains a sustained state of profound understanding, continuously dwelling in the clarity of enlightenment. Hence, by cultivating opportunities for such enlightening experiences, ordinary individuals can gradually approach the Buddha's enlightened state. Strategies for fostering these aha moments will be explored further in subsequent discussions. Traditional interpretations of Buddhism, particularly based on Chinese translations of Buddhist scriptures, often depict the Buddha's enlightenment as an incomprehensible feat unattainable by ordinary individuals. It was portrayed as an eternal mystery, compelling aspirants to engage in arduous, protracted practices in pursuit of an elusive goal. Contrarily, Sanskrit scriptures, written in an ancient Indian language, that enlightenment is accessible to all, and attainable even daily. However, the Buddha's enlightenment is distinguished by its completeness, perfection, and permanence, a stark contrast to the fleeting insights experienced by ordinary individuals. Enlightenment, therefore, is not the sole prerogative of the Buddha, it is a vast realm open to all who aspire to its attainment, if only for a fleeting moment. What is Buddhism? Basics Part 3. What did the Buddha, Shakyamuni, realize? How did he achieve enlightenment? As previously mentioned, the Buddha delved deeply into his inner world, ultimately achieving a profound understanding of the fundamental nature of existence. Central to Buddhism is the belief that the vast universe perceived externally is, in fact, a reflection of the world within us. Understanding this core premise is essential to grasping the essence of Buddhism. In the Hollywood movie, Matrix, individuals trapped in capsules receive sensory signals from a sophisticated computer, creating the illusion of a tangible reality. Similarly, our perception of starlight, daily experiences, and sensory stimuli is interpreted by our consciousness, whether they originate externally or internally. Even within the realm of physics, which was historically dominated by a materialistic worldview, it has become evident that the observation of elementary particles by human consciousness profoundly influences their state. This phenomenon, known as the quantum observation problem, has puzzled researchers since the early 20th century. In the 21st century, it was confirmed that a state of the quantum, which is the basis of all matter, can only be determined by selecting from a myriad of possible coexisting states, and this principle is the basis of today's quantum computing. Although the exact mechanism has not yet been elucidated, the possibility that human consciousness may play some role in the process of determining a state from an infinite number of coexisting quantum states suggests that the state of the material world, including elementary particles, is not objectively determined from the beginning. As a result, the very idea of the existence of an objective world that has been determined from the beginning is now being forced to reconsider. Moreover, contemporary cosmology posits that human existence significantly shapes the universe's configuration. Contrary to the conventional view of humans as insignificant in the vastness of the cosmos, current cosmological theories propose an infinite multiverse, with each moment branching into myriad possibilities. The Anthropic principle suggests that the existence of any particular universe is contingent upon the presence of human beings. While delving into physics is beyond the scope of this discussion on Buddhism, these insights underscore the remarkable proximity between Buddhist philosophy and scientific understanding. Interested readers can explore further through books and online resources on quantum mechanics and cosmology to verify the assertions made here. In summary, the Buddha's realization stemmed from his profound exploration of the inner world, unveiling the inseparable relation between consciousness and reality, a core tenet of Buddhist doctrine. What is Buddhism? The Basics Part 4. Contents of Enlightenment. What, then, constituted the essence of the Buddha's enlightenment? The Buddha embarked on his quest by meticulously scrutinizing his mind. Who am I? What is my true nature? What defines the self? After prolonged contemplation, he arrived at a profound realization. There existed no inherent, immutable essence of self. Rather, there existed only the concept of self, a mere assumption devoid of substantive grounding. This assumption, ingrained at the core of his being, served as the foundation from which various functions emanated to safeguard and perpetuate this perceived self. He discerned that the belief of self was found to have a strong function to distinguish itself from others and other entities, and to maintain self, to compete with others for survival. To illustrate, envision a single wave in the vast expanse of the ocean suddenly awakening to its existence as I. Surveying the ocean from this newfound self-awareness, it perceives myriad other waves engaged in competitive struggle. Determined not to succumb to the competition, it endeavors to bolster its existence, striving to emerge as a stronger, larger wave amidst the fray. Yet, the fundamental truth lies in the interconnectedness of all waves within the ocean. Each wave, despite its apparent individuality, shares a common essence and is inherently interconnected with all others. The distinction between waves is but an illusion, a product of assumption. The moment a wave relinquishes its identification as a distinct entity and recognizes its inherent unity with the vast expanse of the ocean, the illusion of self dissolves, and it merges seamlessly with the entirety of the oceanic expanse. In essence, the Buddha's enlightenment signifies transcending the confines of selfish delusion, the erroneous belief in an independent, isolated self, and attaining awareness of the profound interconnectedness that pervades all existence. What is Buddhism? Basics Part 5. The 12 Dependent Originations. The concept of self, which we've explored thus far, arises from what Buddhism terms primordial ignorance, a lack of realization concerning the ultimate interconnectedness and oneness of all existence. This ignorance initiates a chain reaction known as the 12 dependent originations, unfolding in 12 distinct stages. Firstly, primordial ignorance gives rise to the formative function, which fabricates the illusion of a self and other entities. This, in turn, leads to the emergence of the discerning function, responsible for identifying these fabricated entities. Subsequently, various forms and names or concepts manifest, followed by the development of sixth sense functions to perceive them from different perspectives. The sensory functions generate corresponding sixth sensory information, triggering the feeling functions to recognize and categorize these sensations. Consequently, the seeking function arises, driven by a desire to acquire what has been recognized, leading to the clinging function, which strives to possess the sought-after objects. This clinging becomes the impetus for the formation of individual existence, culminating in the birth of an individual. The individual undergoes the inevitable stages of aging and death, perpetuating the cycle of existence. This process begins with a fundamental ignorance of the interconnectedness and unity of all things, which fosters a fixation on the self and the assumption of many other opposing selves, resulting in an ongoing struggle until death. Even after death, this cycle repeats with a new self. The 12 dependent originations meticulously explain the development of suffering caused by the ego's fixation on self, devoid of awareness of the interconnectedness and unity of all things. This culminates in being born into the physical world and progressing through aging and death. However, it seems that understanding these processes has been historically difficult, because the worldview is completely different from that of the popular naive realism. Naive realism posits that perceptions and desires only arise after birth into this world. According to the 12 dependent originations, however, individual formation occurs for the first time in the 10th stage, formation of individual existence, which is nearly the final stage. Subsequently, in the 11th stage, birth of an individual, one is born into the world, allowing for perception and desire. Therefore, the 1st to 9th stages elucidate the metaphysical, invisible world processes preceding individual birth. Naive realism assumes that only the visible physical world constitutes reality, relegating events outside this realm as metaphysical, implying unrealistic. Conversely, Buddhism views the entire world as a mental construct, where the so-called physical world is a component. Thus, the 12 causal processes occur within the realm of the mind, with only the stages from birth to old age and death manifesting in the physical world. Buddhism posits that these physical processes stem from numerous preceding mental processes. Naive realism commonly assumes that the external world predates human existence, with individuals being born into this world with physical bodies. It asserts that the external material world represents objective reality, while the internal world of the mind constitutes personal thoughts. In contrast, Buddhism asserts that the apparent external material world projects information from within onto the outside world. Our perceptions and feelings merely react to this projected information. Therefore, Buddhism does not delineate separate worlds such as the material world and the world of the mind. The 6 sensory functions precede the 6 sensory information, because Buddhism posits that sensory information projects outward from the 6 sensory functions: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and consciousness. For instance, while one may traditionally believe external smells are perceived through the nose, Buddhism suggests smell information within consciousness projects externally through the nose's sensory function. Similarly, visual, tactile, and gustatory sensations of items like mushrooms are projected externally through respective sensory functions: eye, body, tongue. Though complex, the core issue revolves around whether we perceive the world as extending outward or inward. Traditionally, we perceive mushroom scent, visual data, touch, and taste as originating externally and stimulating our sensory functions. Buddhism proposes stimulation originates inwardly, not externally. This perspective isn't far-fetched when viewed differently. Moreover, quantum mechanics developed since the first half of the 20th century proposed that the state of elementary particles constituting matter's ultimate elements remains indeterminate until observed by human consciousness. This indicates the material world cannot exist independently of consciousness. Even Einstein, the relativity theory's founder, initially doubted quantum mechanics, querying, "Does quantum mechanics imply the moon is not definite when not observed?" Subsequent experiments validated quantum mechanics' conclusions. Thus, Buddhism's assertion that the external world depends on human consciousness aligns with scientific findings. Finally, reaffirming the 12 dependent originations again, common sense posits individual, human conception begins only after body formation. Conversely, Buddhism teaches a 12-stage process initiating with self-delusion and countless other beings formed by the formative function, triggered by the primordial ignorance, which is unaware of the infinite interconnectedness and unity of all things, followed by the discerning function, identifying them. Then, forms, names, and concepts, are attributed to these beings. The ensuing, sensory function, projects their information outward, generating 6, sensory information, pieces. The feeling functions recognize and categorize these sensations, prompting the seeking function, driven by desire, and the clinging function, striving to possess desired objects. This culminates in the formation of individual existence, and the birth of an individual. Aging and death ensue, perpetuating the cycle of rebirth if unaltered. What is Buddhism? Basics Part 6. How did the Buddha transmit the content of his enlightenment to others? From the moment of his enlightenment to the time he first shared his insights with others. As illustrated in the wave metaphor, the Buddha recognized that ignorance of the true nature of existence, the ultimate interconnectedness and oneness, spawns actions of differentiation and separation. This gives rise to the illusion of a false self and myriad opposing entities. He realized that these delusions and the resulting sufferings, conflicts, attachments, losses, persist until one grasps the falsity of these delusions and perceives reality as it truly is. Initially, the Buddha grappled with the challenge of conveying an experience unknown to others. Just as describing the taste of an apple to someone who has never eaten one presents difficulties, elucidating the profound insights of his enlightenment proved daunting. After deliberation, the Buddha resolved to begin with what he believed others could comprehend. He considered his 5 former companions, with whom he had previously practiced. Thus, he journeyed to Sarnath, near Varanasi, approximately 250 kilometers from Bodh Gaya, the site of his enlightenment. How he learned of his friends' whereabouts remains a mystery. Their absence upon his arrival was a possibility, given the lack of communication methods like phones or messaging services. Legend has it that when the Buddha contemplated abandoning his mission due to the perceived profundity of his insights, a celestial deity known as Brahma implored him to teach the Dharma. Yet, this narrative likely serves to emphasize the superiority of the Buddha's teachings over conventional Brahmanism. In truth, the Buddha's decision to teach stemmed from his earnest desire to share his realizations with others. It was not because of Brahma's request, but rather a reflection of his innate impulse to disseminate newfound knowledge, a trait common among those who wish to share their discoveries. Returning to the narrative, the Buddha embarked on a 250-kilometer journey from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath, where he joyously reunited with his former companions, eager to impart his wisdom to any receptive ears. What is Buddhism? Basics Part 7. The Middle Way, the Four Noble Truths, and the Noble Eightfold Paths. If you understand this part, you will understand the basics of Buddhism. What the Buddha first taught. The Middle Way. The Buddha first taught the essential elements of enlightenment to his old friends. At the time, asceticism, which sharpened the mind by subjecting the body to extreme suffering, was the norm, but to the 5 companions who had once shared the practice of asceticism, he preached as follows. One cannot become enlightened by tormenting the body, nor can one become enlightened by indulging in carnal desires. He likened it to a string on a veena instrument that is too tight and it will break, or too loose and it will not sound good, but only the right amount of tension will produce a good sound. This metaphor for the middle way is very easy to understand, and because it is so easy to understand, many people have come to understand the middle way as a balanced way of life that avoids extremes. It is true that living a balanced life is not an easy task, and it is certainly a big enough challenge in itself. However, if the Buddha had only realized something that everyone could easily understand, he would not have had to worry about whether or not people would understand the contents of his enlightenment from the beginning. The middle way is the state that Buddha himself attained, or in other words, the state of enlightenment itself. The content of enlightenment revealed in the 12 dependent origination and the state that results from it is the middle way. In other words, to reach the middle way, one must not adhere to the viewpoint of oneself, but rather, by becoming transcendent, one can realize the interconnectedness and oneness of all things. I believe that such a state of being is the state of the middle way. However, the Buddha was troubled by the difficulty of explaining the middle way, which transcends all relative perspectives, because it is impossible in principle to explain it in language, which is based on relative comparative categorization. That is why it seems that the Buddha had no choice but to explain the middle way only to the extent that everyone could understand it anyway. As a result, it seems that the true meaning of the middle way, which the Buddha attained, was not properly understood even by his disciples after his death. After the Buddha's death, in organizing and categorizing his teachings, the interpretation that certain things had substance was rampant, and such a misunderstanding persisted until the appearance of Nāgārjuna in the 2nd century. Nāgārjuna redefined the Buddha's teaching of the middle way, using the term śūnya, which means emptiness, arguing that such a substantivist interpretation was not only contrary to the Buddha's teaching of impermanence and selflessness, but above all to the teaching of the middle way. He taught that everything consists of relationships and has no substance of its own, and that in order to recognize this, it is essential to have a higher perspective, that transcends all perspectives, without depending on any one of them. In other words, from assuming one perspective of oneself, many things that are in opposition to oneself are assumed, and the endless competition for survival with them begins. If we do not adhere to one viewpoint, we will not perceive many things other than ourself as opponents, but rather, we will feel a fundamental connection with them. Therefore, if we do not assume or get caught up in the viewpoint of self from the beginning, there will be no competition for survival with many others that starts there, nor will there be suffering that arises from the desire for survival of self only as a delusion. Thus, it is precisely the condition of transcending all particular viewpoints, without being fixed on one's own viewpoint, that the Buddha was trying to convey with the term middle way. Four Noble Truths, and Noble Eightfold Path. Thus, the competition for survival and attachment confusion with others that results from attachment to the viewpoint of self, brings suffering. Therefore, for those who do not know the middle way, and are attached to the viewpoint of self, 1. The world is suffering, 2. The cause of suffering is the desire of self is delusion, 3. If the cause is removed, suffering will disappear, and 4. The way to remove the cause is the middle way, which means to leave the viewpoint of self, and think about the connection and unity with all others. Specifically, we must always remain in the state of the middle way, i.e., leaving the perspective of oneself, and focusing on the connection and oneness with all others, in the following 8 actions. 1. How we see things, 2. How we think, 3. How we speak, 4. What we do, 5. How we live, 6. Our efforts, 7. Our awareness, and 8. How we focus our minds. The first 4 truths 1, 2, 3, and 4 are called the 4 Noble Truths, and the 8 right paths 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 that follow them are called the Noble Eightfold Path. Then what is the right path? As mentioned earlier, it is the middle way, which does not adhere to any particular viewpoint of oneself, but transcends it. Therefore, the famous 4 Noble Truths, and the Noble Eightfold Path, must all be understood from the perspective of the middle way, or else, we will lose sight of their true meaning. What is Buddhism? Basics 8. The true meaning of impermanence of all phenomena and non-substantiality of all dharmas. First of all, why do we say impermanence of all phenomena? When we examine the words more precisely, the original term of phenomenon or phenomena is the Sanskrit word samskara, and its original meaning is something like potentiality for formation. In Buddhism, it is the second crucial element that comes after avidya, the first element meaning the primordial ignorance mentioned in the 12 dependent originations. Samskara refers to the function of conceiving the world through the delusion of self-other separation. In other words, it is the function of creating an imaginary self, based on the fundamental ignorance, avidya, which means not knowing the ultimate interconnectedness and oneness of all existence, and separating oneself from others, creating a distinction between oneself and everything else, through delusion of self-other separation, thereby conceiving the whole world. Samskara also refers to everything conceived by these functions. So all phenomena mean everything conceived by samskara, formative force. As mentioned earlier, avidya, primordial ignorance, or fundamental ignorance of not knowing the ultimate interconnectedness and oneness of all existence, is the result of a lack of the perspective of the middle way, or the way of seeing things without persisting in one's viewpoint as suggested by Buddha. In essence, those trapped in ignorance of not knowing the middle way set a single viewpoint of self, and by establishing this viewpoint of self, it constructs numerous other selves. In such a conceived world, it repeatedly competes for survival with all others. All these others are essentially conceived by the delusion of separation of self and others, and conflicts and struggles are inevitable. And such delusion will continue until the perfect middle way is attained. Furthermore, everything conceived by samskara, the function of conceiving numerous others, by establishing a single viewpoint of self, is merely a name, given to the juncture of semi-relational constructs, based on comparison and classification, between self and others or among others. There is no substantial essence or entity, corresponding to the name. Therefore, the term, non-substantiality of all dharmas, refers to the fact, that all such conceived things lack their substantiality. Later, this concept of non-self is expressed using the term, śūnya, emptiness. The term, dharma, is highly confusing, originally from Sanskrit, dharma, a well-known term meaning, principle, or, law. However, in Buddhism, it is used to mean, truth, or, teaching, because Shakyamuni Buddha taught the Dharma. Therefore, the usage of the term, dharma, to refer to something conceived by human consciousness, is a highly derivative usage. Now, it may be relatively easy to understand the concept of non-substantiality of all dharmas, which asserts that everything conceived by human consciousness is merely names and concepts without corresponding entities. However, the inevitability of these conceived things, being impermanent, is not necessarily very clear. This is because, it involves the essence of time. Until Einstein's theory of relativity was published, time was considered to be an extremely objective entity, like a guardian, governing everything in the universe, regardless of where one was in the universe, or what mode of transportation one used. All clocks were believed to tick the same time. However, with Einstein's theory of relativity, it was understood that time is relative to individual states of motion, and if individual states of motion differ, then each time also differs. In other words, time is unique to individual perspectives, and if states of motion differ, the passage of time also differs. Yet, not everything in the world has time. There are things unaffected by time, things that never stop at any point. These are light. Because light moves at the speed of light, time completely stops for light. Moreover, since the length of things moving at the speed of light shrinks infinitely, all the distance in the path of light passes by at the speed of light, even if the distance is billions of kilometers, becomes zero. It is often said, when looking at the stars in the night sky, that starlight is from 10,000 years ago. Indeed, from our human perspective, light from a star 10,000 light-years away, flies to Earth over 10,000 years, and covers an incomprehensible distance. Yet, from the perspective of light itself, there is no time for light, and the distance from that star to Earth becomes zero, as it passes at the speed of light. Thus, light from that star reaches Earth, in an instant without spending a second, or traveling a meter. This is what Einstein's theory of relativity implies. If you find it hard to believe, please read introductory and technical books on Einstein's theory of relativity yourself, until you are convinced that all the above statements are true. In other words, time is unique to specific perspectives, and for things constantly at the speed of light, like light itself, time and space do not exist. As mentioned earlier on this site, the world we see seems to be expanding outward, but it may be projected outward through a projector called consciousness from within. Even the light of stars in the night sky may come from within us, and when projected outward through our consciousness, the time of 10,000 light-years, and the distance of trillions of kilometers, may be conceived. In other words, impermanence of all phenomena refers to the situation where people ignorant of the middle way construct a relative world around themselves, through consciousness trapped in a single viewpoint of self, where everything is governed by time, and there is nothing that does not change. That is to say, when things in the world are conceived by the formative power of samskara, the back and forth relationship of the conceived things is perceived as the flow of time, which is also perceived as change, and therefore, everything conceived is perceived as changing with the flow of time. Then, it is inevitably felt that everything we perceive changes with the flow of time, meaning, all phenomena are impermanent. Thus, if one can cultivate a mindset of the perfect middle way, without setting a single viewpoint of self, and always moving beyond any specific point, like light itself, one may reach a state beyond all relative viewpoints, where there is neither time, nor space like light. Perhaps such a state is the state Shakyamuni Buddha attained. Since such a state transcends all relative states, it cannot be expressed in language, based on comparison, contrast, discrimination, or classification, and therefore, it must have been difficult for him to convey it to others. If Shakyamuni Buddha's enlightenment is a state without time or space like light itself, then just as the light from 10,000 years ago arrives instantaneously, Shakyamuni Buddha's enlightenment may also reach us instantly, 10,000 years ago, or 10,000 years from now, and we may be able to perceive it whenever we want. Perhaps this is the meaning of the eternal nature of Buddhahood, taught in texts like the Lotus Sutra. In this way, the state of the middle way, taught by Shakyamuni Buddha, transcends all relative viewpoints, and thus, there is neither time nor space, but it may also be a state, where one can reach all conceived existences instantly beyond time, making it possible to interact with everything that is conceived. I think it is extremely difficult for ordinary people like us, to achieve a mindset of the perfect middle way like Shakyamuni Buddha, but ultimately if we stop clinging to our viewpoints, and cultivate the habit of always wishing for the happiness of others, and thinking from their perspective, we may move closer to the middle way. Perhaps, we may catch a glimpse of the state Shakyamuni Buddha fully attained even if only for a moment. In everyday life, rather than insisting on our views, if we cultivate the habit of considering the positions and the viewpoints of others, starting from our family, friends, and colleagues, we can begin to see things that were not visible from our viewpoint, and understand the feelings of those around us. This is a very common sense thing, but it is precisely by transcending our viewpoints that we can steadily approach the middle way as taught by Shakyamuni Buddha. What is Buddhism? Applications Part 1. Multiple Paths to Liberation. In the basic section, I provided an overview of the basic teachings expounded by Shakyamuni Buddha. From here on, I would like to explore how these fundamental teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha have been received and practiced subsequently. As explained towards the end of the basic section, those trapped in ignorance, unaware of the middle way, establish a single perspective of themselves. By setting up this perspective of self, they construct numerous others apart from themselves. Since all these others are fabricated by the delusion of self-other separation, they inherently entail division and conflict. Love and separation, hatred and friction are inevitable, and the suffering persists until the realization of the middle way. However, even if one were to say they do not know the middle way, aside from the Buddha who fully realized it, neither humans nor any other living beings know the middle way. Therefore, the delusion of self-other separation due to ignorance, which does not understand the true nature of this matter, is not just a superficial issue like a human misunderstanding. Instead, it is a matter of a fundamental delusion that leads to the creation of the world we experience. As the most important premise, Buddhism does not consider the existence of a creator in this world or universe. This is because the world and universe are not singular, and each of our minds projects its own world outward like a projector. In other words, each of our minds is the creator of each of our own worlds. As explained earlier on this site, in the Buddhist worldview, this world is not conceived as an objective material realm external to oneself, as commonly perceived. Rather, the world that seems to extend outward is actually an inner world, and information originating from within is projected outward through individual consciousness. Moreover, modern physics also acknowledges the decisive role of human consciousness in the state determination of subatomic particles. If we assume that the material world exists external to humans, then subatomic particle states should have been determined before reaching human consciousness. However, according to quantum physics, it's understood that until human consciousness is involved, the state of subatomic particles remains indeterminate. This fact negates the assumption that the state of elementary particles is already determined before they reach human consciousness, which means that it also negates the assumption that the material world exists in an objectively determined state from the beginning, independent of human consciousness. Delving deeper into this topic would lead us to discussions of quantum theory's observation problem and the multiverse interpretation in modern physics. Interested readers are encouraged to explore these topics further, referring to the related books and papers. Moreover, according to the Buddhist worldview and referencing the forefront of modern physics, it can be assumed that the information originating from within is not uniformly shared among all individuals. Rather, it includes all possibilities, and each person's consciousness selects one of these possibilities every moment, projecting it as their external world. Thus, the unfolding of the world projected outside each person's consciousness is influenced by the state of that person's consciousness. It implies that humanity does not universally share the same future. In extreme terms, each individual's future unfolds differently. Furthermore, the world seen by each person varies. Until recently, it was common sense to think that we, humanity, and all life share one universe, one history, and one future. However, according to the latest quantum theory and cosmology, the probability of the universe randomly creating conditions suitable for human survival is 1 part in 1,200 power of 10. If there were only one universe, such an event with such a probability could never occur by chance. However, since humanity exists, the only rational explanation is that there are 10 to the 1,200th power different parallel universes. In other words, in most of these universes, there may not even be an Earth, let alone human beings. However, if we apply the principle of quantum mechanics that the state of matter cannot be determined without the involvement of human consciousness, we may not be able to say that these human-less universes exist in a determined state. If all possibilities are realized as separate universes, however, the universes in which the Earth and human beings appear will always exist. Likewise, there may be countless universes with different human histories. When humanity looks back on its past from such universes, it may seem like a miraculous coincidence that humanity was born. However, in reality, it's because we happen to exist in a universe where humanity was born among countless universes. Thus, one can conclude from the latest cosmology that the existence of humankind is not miraculous, but rather a matter of course. Our universe, where we reside, appears to branch out into countless possibilities every moment. Each person's consciousness seems to select one of these possibilities every moment and project it onto their surroundings. Thus, it's considered that each person's consciousness selects one possibility from countless possibilities every moment and projects the world around them based on the accumulated memories of their past actions. Therefore, everything one perceives is a result of their own choices and cannot be blamed on anyone else. In the end, we've strayed quite a bit into cosmological discussions, but what I wanted to convey this time is that to transcend the delusion of self, which arises from fundamental ignorance, there are several methods. Buddhism presents various methods, ranging from those that can be immediately practiced depending on the individual to those that require an incredibly long time and thorough dedication. I will explain this further in the following sections. What is Buddhism? Applications. Part 2. What is an arhat? Arhat, the path to eradicating attachment to the self, the goal of practice in Theravada Buddhism. As explained in the previous basic section, to his 5 old friends, Shakyamuni taught the middle way, the 4 noble truths, and the noble eightfold path, as methods for transcending the delusion of self. This method involved recognizing that the concept of self is fundamentally based on delusion without inherent existence. It involves acknowledging the situation where various attachments cling to the delusional self, and ultimately, through eliminating all attachments thoroughly, eradicating the delusion of self entirely. Eventually, all 5 old friends are said to have become arhats. An arhat refers to an individual, a person who, through eradicating all attachments and delusions back to their root causes, thereby eliminating the causes of individual existence by tracing through the 12 stages of dependent origination. Please refer to the Basics Part 5 for details. This leads to a state of nirvana where one no longer returns to the cycle of samsara. However, since desires to maintain the physical body persist as long as the body survives, nirvana in this state, where residual desires remain, is called, with remainder nirvana. It is only when the body dies that no desires remain whatsoever, and it is called, without remainder nirvana. The term, arhat, originally meant, one worthy of respect, and it is also translated as, one who is worthy of offerings. Although Shakyamuni attained complete enlightenment and became a Buddha, he was also an arhat. Thus, Shakyamuni, who became a Buddha, was also an arhat. However, can we say that everyone who becomes an arhat becomes a Buddha? It seems not. At least, in all Buddhist scriptures, there are many descriptions of Shakyamuni's disciples becoming arhats, but there is no description of any of them becoming Buddhas. Generally, it is also seen that later Mahayana Buddhism unjustly belittled the state of arhatship. However, even in the early Buddhist scriptures, there are no examples of Shakyamuni's disciples being called Buddhas. Moreover, practitioners of today's Theravada Buddhism, traditionally transmitted as the Southern Transmission Buddhism, which regards the state of arhatship as the ultimate goal, themselves have the realization that they can become arhats but not Buddhas. Hence, there seems to be an understanding from very early stages that arhats and Buddhas are different. Moreover, some people questioned whether it was somewhat heartless to become an arhat quickly and bid farewell to the cycle of samsara, leaving behind many suffering beings, and said, because you are so heartless, you cannot become Buddhas. To become a Buddha, shouldn't you dedicate yourself more to helping other beings? These people eventually formed separate sects, which led to the development of later Mahayana Buddhism. What is Buddhism? Applications, Part 3. Bodhisattva. The essential way of living to attain Buddhahood. As I mentioned earlier, like the arhat, who focuses on their practice of entering nirvana as quickly as possible, it can be said that this is fundamentally the most direct method to transcend the illusion of self. That's why I think Shakyamuni taught such methods to his disciples from the beginning. Also, if fundamentally the notion of self is a product of ignorance that doesn't know the true nature of things, then the existence of many others imagined in contrast to oneself is also only imagined and ultimately insubstantial. Therefore, being attached to these insubstantial existences obstructs the practice of eradicating all attachments. However, just as we cannot easily believe that our existence is merely an illusion without substance, many others also believe the same. Even though enlightened individuals might see everyone struggling within illusions, until one ultimately realizes this fact, our suffering and the suffering of many others are an undeniable reality. From the perspective of someone deeply immersed in such suffering, even if told by an enlightened person that your suffering is merely a product of illusion, you might only think, that's none of your business. The other day, one of famous Japanese singers passed away. She continued to suffer from unexplained severe pain and went to see a doctor. The doctor said it was probably just her imagination since no physical cause was found, but the severe pain continued and she eventually committed suicide because she could not bear the pain any longer. Even if there is no physical cause at all, in cases of serious depression, severe pain may persist due to mental reasons or delusions. In other words, whether the reason is rational or merely delusional, the person is still suffering, and the fact that the suffering is merely delusional does not at all mean that it can be ignored. In this way, people's suffering and sadness, even if caused by illusions and attachments without any substance, continue to torment them as a stark reality until they realize this fact. Considering that most people are far from enlightenment, many wonder whether it's socially and ethically acceptable to ignore these suffering people and solely focus on one's own practice. Furthermore, ethically, if one truly doesn't cling to oneself, then there should be no difference in importance between oneself and others. Therefore, solely focusing on one's enlightenment while ignoring the suffering of others might be evidence of being trapped in the notion of self. From this perspective, when we consider the example of Buddha himself, it has been said since the time of early Buddhism, that Buddha became a Buddha, as a result of his countless acts of altruism as a bodhisattva, in his previous lives. This is the difference between Buddha, who became Buddha, and ordinary human beings, who can only become arhats. A group of practitioners began to emerge who thought that, if this was the case, why not live as bodhisattvas, practicing altruism like the Buddha? Bodhisattva is a person who is on the path towards bodhi, awakening, or Buddhahood. Unlike the arhat, the bodhisattva deliberately maintains a strong attachment to wishing for others' happiness without eradicating the cause of their existence, repeatedly being reborn into the cycle of existence to devote their lives to alleviating others' suffering through their enlightenment. In other words, for the bodhisattva, there is no difference in the importance of oneself and others. Therefore, the practice for enlightenment must involve oneself and others simultaneously, otherwise, it would be meaningless. Moreover, by consistently wishing for others' happiness and sharing their suffering, sadness, and joy, without being confined to the perspective of oneself, gradually one attains the state of the middle way. Like an arhat, eradicating the perspective of self through meditation and self-awareness practice is one way to transcend oneself, yet, as a bodhisattva, by always considering things from others' standpoint, empathizing with them, and continuing to sympathize with them, thus slowly feeling the unity with others, is another definite path to transcend oneself. In this way, there are paths to transcending the illusion of self and progressing beyond it, as taught in Buddhism. Besides the above two paths, various other paths have been proposed and developed into different forms of Buddhism later on. What is Buddhism? Applications, Part 4-1. The path to liberate oneself by thoroughly realizing one's powerlessness. As we've seen earlier, both the path of arhat and the path of bodhisattva require considerable determination and faith, making it difficult to claim that anyone can pursue them. Incidentally, as time progressed, not only within Buddhism but also in a global religious trend, there emerged a flourishing faith in transcendent beings with the great intention of saving people, entrusting oneself entirely to them for salvation. While this faith takes various forms and cannot be uniformly described, the ultimate attitude involves thoroughly recognizing one's powerlessness, abandoning all arrogance that one can manage oneself, and solely entrusting oneself to the will of the transcendent Savior, allowing the will of the transcendent to work within oneself. Eventually, one may find oneself in a state of mind where the illusion of self that one clung to so tightly is forgotten. Although no academic proof has yet been provided, it seems quite possible that these religious trends around AD influenced the birth of Christianity, became the source of Bhakti Yoga in India, and influenced Buddhism, leading to the compilation of the Pure Land scriptures. In fact, the Pure Land scriptures are believed to have been compiled around AD. The basic premise of the scriptures is the vow of Bodhisattva Dharmakara, who later became Amitabha Buddha. Dharmakara Bodhisattva made 48 vows, among which the 18th vow has traditionally been given special importance. In essence, if summarized, it means that when I become a Buddha, if anyone in this universe believes in my vow, desires to be reborn in my world, and continuously recites the name, Amitabha Buddha, as my Buddha name, but cannot be born in my world, then I will not enter the ultimate stage of Buddhahood either. What is the difference between Buddha and arhat? Essentially, it means that one will not attain Buddhahood until all beings attain it, which is truly the ultimate state of mind as a bodhisattva. From this perspective, the difference between arhat and Buddha mentioned earlier in the previous chapter may lie here. In other words, it is suggested that a Buddha does not enter complete nirvana until the very end. What is a Tathagata? Buddha and Tathagata. As explained earlier in the section on bodhisattvas, if both oneself and others are caught in the same illusion and suffering, there is no reason to prioritize oneself, and it is only natural to strive for the liberation of oneself and others from this illusion. In other words, the notion of prioritizing oneself is evidence of being trapped in the notion of self. A true bodhisattva is one who, like the bodhisattva Dharmakara mentioned above, vows not to attain Buddhahood until all beings attain Buddhahood. Continuing this way of life as a bodhisattva until the very end, without uprooting the illusion of self and others like an arhat, without clinging to either the viewpoint of oneself or the viewpoint of others, reaching the state of perfect middle way may be the state of Buddha, also known as Tathagata. Tathagata means, one who has reached the true world and returns from there, indicating a Buddha who has reached the true world but continues to emit teachings in this world to assist all beings in enlightenment, without disappearing from this world. What is Buddhism? Applications. Part 4-2. The state of enlightenment is the state of light. The state likened to light itself, called Tathagata. As explained in the Basics Part 8, if one can attain a state of mind that is a perfect middle way, without setting oneself as a viewpoint and not lingering on any one point, then perhaps one can reach a state beyond all relative perspectives, just like light itself, where there is no time or space. The world of Buddha's enlightenment described in the Buddhist scriptures is a world that transcends even form and concept, much like the world seen from the perspective of light, which transcends time and space. If the Buddhist state of enlightenment is like light itself, without time or space, then just as light from 10,000 years ago can reach anywhere instantly from the viewpoint of light, the Buddha's enlightenment can also reach anywhere instantly from its viewpoint, meaning it is always present at anywhere at any time for those in the relative world. Just as light can reach anywhere instantly beyond time and space, the Buddha's world of enlightenment, which transcends the relative world, also can be felt at anywhere at any time. In this way, the state reached by those who become Buddhas or Tathagata through the true Bodhisattva practice, like Bodhisattva Dharmakara, indeed seems to be a state likened to light itself. Interestingly, Amitabha Buddha, in the ancient Indian language, means one who possesses infinite light, or one who possesses infinite life, illuminating the darkness of ignorance, and signifies a Buddha who is not bound by the constraints of space and time. Moreover, the term Vairocana, which appears in the Avatamsaka Sutra, means to illuminate all pervasively. Therefore, both Vairocana and Mahavairocana have the same origin in the word Vairocana. This word, Vairocana, also appears in the sutra expounded by the Buddha on practice of the way through contemplation of the Bodhisattva all-embracing goodness, which is said to be the concluding sutra of the Lotus Sutra, describing Shakyamuni Buddha as Vairocana. Although, one should be careful about the nuances in each scripture, they all derive from the fundamental meaning of illuminating the darkness of ignorance. Thus, both Amitabha Buddha and Vairocana Buddha share the characteristic of illuminating all pervasively, and indeed, one can say that Tathagata are beings likened to light itself. How one approaches Tathagata, beings akin to light, may determine differences in faith attitudes. Now, let's take an overview of what types of religious attitudes have developed in Mahayana Buddhism. Approaches based on Pure Land scriptures. In Pure Land scriptures, people are encouraged to believe in the vow of Amitabha Buddha and continue to contemplate him and his Pure Land. Furthermore, as the ultimate form of such faith, in 13th century Japan, a faith attitude called complete entrust to the power of Amitabha Buddha's mercy, by Shinran, emerged, wherein one thoroughly acknowledges one's powerlessness and wholeheartedly entrusts oneself to the will of the transcendent Savior, ultimately striving to attain a state of mind where the illusion of self is forgotten. I think this was the ultimate form that Pure Land scriptures originally intended. It has been said traditionally that the path of completely surrendering oneself to Amitabha's mercy, as Shinran teaches, is an easy way for anyone to do it, yet, as a matter of fact, it may not be so easy in practice to truly abandon one's ego and surrender one's entire self to Amitabha Buddha. Approaches based on the Lotus Sutra. In the Lotus Sutra, the attitude of faith toward its eternally enlightened Buddha seems to be that of a master and a disciple. According to the Lotus Sutra, one can receive teachings from the eternally enlightened Buddha, who is united with the realm of enlightenment, through the Lotus Sutra at any time, as long as one has a strong aspiration. One can carry out the Bodhisattva practice with other sentient beings, receiving wisdom and insight from the eternally enlightened Buddha from the realm of enlightenment. In that sense, the method of walking the Bodhisattva path while receiving teachings from the Buddha, through the Lotus Sutra may be a very time-consuming path that can only be followed step by step, but, for those who truly wish to perform the Bodhisattva practice, it may be an easier path to follow. Approaches based on the scriptures of Tantric Buddhism. In the Mahavairocana Sutra compiled around the 7th century in Tantric Buddhism, it is said that the goal is to become one with Mahavairocana. However, as Tantric Buddhism is also known as esoteric Buddhism, many practices are allowed only to those who have specially trained in them, and it is considered to be a very hard practice for the average person. Approaches in Zen Buddhism. Apart from sutra-based sects and forms of practice, Zen Buddhism, introduced by Bodhidharma from India to China, has developed independently in China and Japan. It is now well known worldwide as a representative form of Buddhist practice. In Zen Buddhism, one is expected to attain enlightenment similar to the Buddha through continuous meditation, just as the Buddha attained enlightenment through meditation. However, the fact that no one other than Shakyamuni Buddha has ever truly become a Buddha in history suggests that it is not easy to become a Buddha even if one continues to meditate in the same way as the Buddha. Since the Buddha, countless numbers of practitioners must have continued to meditate in the same way as the Buddha, but none of them has become a Buddha. What could be the reason? After all, as tradition says, to become a Buddha, it may be essential not only to meditate but also to accumulate altruistic actions as a Bodhisattva. I will examine this point in more detail in a later chapter, Application 9. Thus, it is natural that different faith attitudes are derived from the age of the formation of scriptures and their purposes. What is Buddhism? Applications, Part 5-1. About the theory of emptiness, śūnya, 1. So far, we have mainly focused on the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha since early Buddhism, but as the later period of the flourishing of Mahayana Buddhism approached, the word, emptiness, began to be frequently used, especially in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Emptiness means that fundamentally, everything in this world exists solely in relation to causes and conditions. Nothing has an independent essence or substance on its own, and everything exists merely as conceptualizations, labeled and categorized based on various relationships, existing in people's minds. Therefore, assigning any fixed meaning to these concepts does not imply their inherent existence or unchanging identity. For example, let's take the example of a chair. Upon closer examination, we find that there is nothing but a combination of sponge, fabric, iron, and plastic. We conveniently label the combination of these materials as a chair, but the concept of a chair only exists in our minds. As evidence, someone who does not have the concept of a chair might see it and decide to use it as a table. Therefore, the relationships formed by various materials are fundamentally empty, and whatever meaning we attach to them is subjective. Whether we think of the combination of sponge, fabric, iron, and plastic as a chair, a table, or a toy for writing and playing, it is ultimately up to individual interpretation. However, it is often more convenient in practical life to accept the shared meanings or concepts embraced by the majority of society. Yet, just because a concept is shared by the majority, does not mean that it represents an unchanging essence in reality. However, since childhood, we have been indoctrinated with these shared meanings or concepts, through language, which often leads us to mistakenly believe that these concepts themselves represent the essence, or unchanging identity, of corresponding objects. It's like having what could be termed fixed concepts. As a result, we often find ourselves trapped by countless fixed concepts. It's ridiculous to be ensnared by concepts that are fundamentally provisional and conceptual. This perspective of emptiness emphasizes that there is no inherent, unchanging essence to things, challenging the view that objects possess independent, immutable substances. This perspective was emphasized, especially in the Prajnaparamita texts, precursors of the Mahayana scriptures, around the 3rd to 4th centuries after the passing of Shakyamuni Buddha. It was further elaborated by Nāgārjuna, a scholar from South India, around the 2nd century CE. However, this perspective was not at all a unilateral departure from the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. On the contrary, Shakyamuni taught middle way in the concepts of impermanence and non-self. Impermanence asserts that everything in this world is constantly changing, and nothing retains a permanent identity. Non-self complements impermanence by stating that since nothing maintains a permanent identity, there is no inherent self to be found. To illustrate this with a familiar example, consider the baseball team, New York Yankees, which has been existing since 1913. However, upon closer examination of what constitutes the New York Yankees, it becomes evident that there is no fixed entity or unchanging essence. The team from Babe Ruth's time is vastly different from the current team, in terms of players, coaches, and managers. There is no enduring New York Yankees with unchanging identities. The only thing that might persist indefinitely is the name only. The New York Yankees may have been nothing more than a name, arbitrarily given to a group of specific baseball players from the beginning. Thus, what endures is merely a name, or concept, existing only in people's minds, while the actual players are constantly changing, illustrating impermanence and non-self. Similarly, individual players like Hideki Matsui are composed of approximately 60 trillion cells, which completely regenerate in about 2.5 years. It may be said that his DNA, which is genetic information, is the blueprint for his physical body, and that it is what maintains them. However, it is also said that the way the DNA manifests itself changes dramatically, with changes in the environment. Therefore, at least physically, there is no immutable essence to Hideki Matsui. From a personality point of view also, whether he becomes a successful entrepreneur, or falls into homelessness, his essence does not remain fixed. If there were a fixed essence to Matsui, he wouldn't be able to change, for better or worse. It is precisely because there is no fixed essence or identity that humans can change. Thus, the concepts of impermanence and non-self were initially taught, with the practical aim of eliminating fixed concepts and attachments to oneself and related phenomena. However, around 2 to 3 centuries after Shakyamuni's passing, within the community of Buddhist disciples, who meticulously analyzed and classified Shakyamuni's teachings, a new perspective emerged. While maintaining the stance of non-self, for each individual, the idea that there is some form of substance or essence, inherent in the objects perceived by humans, began to surface especially in the school called Sarvastivada, which produced a great deal of Abhidharma literature. Subsequently, criticism arose against such perspectives. These critics were opposed to their substantialist worldview, which contradicted the Buddha's teaching of selflessness. And because such substantialist thinking developed, among those who considered aratship to be the ultimate goal, criticism was directed not only at their substantialist thinking, but also at the method of practice itself, in pursuit of aratship, and their unsympathetic attitude of leaving many suffering sentient beings alone, and becoming arhats to enter nirvana. Such movement led to the compilation of sutras such as the Prajnaparamita, which focused on the theme of emptiness, negating substantialist worldview, as contradicted the Buddha's teaching of selflessness. These critics also argued that focusing solely on achieving individual enlightenment, aratship, was a selfish approach, and instead advocated for all beings to pursue the path to Buddhahood through Bodhisattva practices. This movement came to be known as Mahayana Buddhism. Around the 2nd century CE, Nāgārjuna appeared, and further elaborated on the perspective of emptiness, outlined in texts like the Prajnaparamita. He critiqued substantialist views, and redefined the concept of emptiness, as emphasizing that nothing possesses inherent, fixed substance or identity, thereby reaffirming Shakyamuni Buddha's stance on impermanence and non-self, and above all, the middle way. What is Buddhism? Applications, Part 5-2. About the theory of emptiness, śūnya 2. So, let's take a closer look at what exactly emptiness means. The earlier example involved various elements like a chair or a human being, complexly intertwined. While it's understandable that these combinations form concepts, some might still think that the fundamental elements themselves exist. Let's consider the example of water. Those with a substantialist viewpoint believe that there's something with the nature or essence of water that exists. However, it's now common knowledge that water is composed of molecules made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, known as H2O. In other words, there isn't an unchanging entity called water, rather, it's just a manifestation based on the relationship between 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, dependent on environmental conditions such as temperature ranging from 1 degree Celsius to 99 degrees Celsius. We humans label this manifestation as water. Essentially, water is just one form manifested by a specific relationship between hydrogen and oxygen atoms under specific temperature conditions, and there's no existence of water beyond the forms manifested by these relationships. As evidence, if the temperature drops below 0 degrees Celsius, it quickly turns into individual ice particles, and if it rises above 100 degrees Celsius, it turns into vapor, becoming invisible. Hence, the manifestation of water, as a result of the specific relationship between hydrogen and oxygen atoms, is limited to certain conditions ranging from 1 degree Celsius to 99 degrees Celsius. If the conditions change, even with the same cause, the manifestation changes. In this way, everything in this world manifests its form based on the relationship between cause and conditions, and without such fixed entities or essences, they are considered empty. Then, hydrogen and oxygen atoms seem to have an entity of their own, but they, too, are ultimately a combination of elementary particles such as protons, neutrons, and electrons. And furthermore, those elementary particles are also said to be combinations of quarks. Quarks are said to manifest their properties through the relationship between several vibrating bodies, and these vibrating bodies are no longer physical objects but are like aggregates of energy, and through the interrelationships between them, aggregates of energy, various properties emerge. It is through the interrelationships among them, aggregates of energy, that various properties are said to emerge. The fact that this relationship determines the way of existence shows that the most advanced findings of modern physics and the ancient Buddhist view of emptiness are in perfect agreement. Since we've delved into abstract discussions for a while, let's now apply the abstract concept of emptiness to our daily lives. Consider a person named A. A is in a relationship with a woman named B, making A B's boyfriend, and B A's girlfriend. However, as their relationship sours, B decides to break up with A. Despite B's decision, A persistently pursues B. Once a beloved boyfriend to B, A is now, in B's eyes, a terrifying stalker, and almost a criminal. At home, however, A is a devoted son who takes care of his elderly parents and is a filial son. At work, A is considered by the president to be an excellent employee, and an obedient subordinate, by A's subordinates to be a terrible boss, by his close colleagues to be a buddy, and by his unfriendly rivals to be his biggest enemy. So, which one is the real A? In fact, all of them are. Depending on the relationship between A and others, the same person, A, can be perceived as a criminal, most filial son, excellent employee, compliant subordinate, terrible supervisor, colleague, or biggest adversary. A himself is inherently empty, and his meaning changes depending on his relationships with others. If you want to change the meaning, you can change the relationship. Alternatively, changing the relationship may alter the meaning. If A were inherently a villain, he would be a villain to everyone and should remain so forever. There wouldn't be anyone for whom he's the most wonderful person. However, in reality, he shows completely different aspects depending on the person, and the meaning also varies accordingly. Thus, there are no fixed natures or essences in things or people, rather, everything is based solely on relationships and conditions, and it's entirely up to us to assign meaning to those relationships. To make this perspective of emptiness more practical in our lives, we can apply it to our actual human relationships. In our daily lives, we encounter various human relationships, some good, some bad, some adversarial, and some friendly. However, fundamentally, all people and events are just empty, and don't inherently hold specific meanings. Whether someone is good, bad, an enemy, an ally, a bad event, or a good event, is just how it appears based on our relationship with them. Originally, we are free to assign any meaning we want to these relationships. For example, if someone speaks ill of us or tries to hinder us, many would label them as an enemy. Once we assign that label, everything they do seems like negative hostile actions. We start hating them, but no matter how much we hate them, it doesn't affect them. Hence, our hatred only amplifies. In this way, by arbitrarily labeling someone as an enemy, we end up suffering greatly. It's like fighting a battle alone. Instead of labeling them as an enemy, if we assign a positive meaning like, thanks to that person, I can recognize my shortcomings and be more careful in my actions. In a way, they're a benefactor, then whatever they do benefits us. If they criticize us, it helps us grow, and if they speak ill of us, it helps us understand how others perceive us, enabling us to grow even more. Thus, depending on how we assign meaning to the actions of others, we can interpret them in any way we want. If there's something unpleasant, we can simply refrain from assigning such meaning in the first place. However, this is purely a theoretical discussion. Humans aren't always rational beings. Viewing things through the lens of emptiness may suggest this, but in reality, it's often challenging to suddenly change our perspectives entirely. Since human relationships are built on various causes and conditions, perhaps the first step is to understand why they've taken a negative turn. For this, effective communication with the other person is crucial. Then, gradually, as our perspectives on each other shift, the relationship may improve. Regardless, humans inherently aren't entirely good or bad. They can be exemplary or flawed depending on various conditions and relationships. Everyone, at some point, may act kindly or maliciously, be respectable or contemptible. Everything changes with each moment's choice and judgment. A person who was once admired by everyone might become a criminal one day, or vice versa. A notorious criminal might sacrifice their life to save a puppy, or a tyrant who once terrorized people like Ashoka might later contribute significantly to spreading Buddhism worldwide. Essentially, people and things are impermanent, egoless, and empty, so no fixed beliefs or concepts apply. So, terms like, this person is admirable, or, that person is worthless, only hold true for about a day. No one knows what will happen tomorrow. Viewed negatively, this might seem unreliable, but positively, it implies that there's always potential for improvement in everyone. In summary, after all the lengthy and convoluted discussion, it can be said that the perspective of emptiness is a way to liberate oneself from all fixed beliefs, assumptions, and attachments. What is Buddhism? Applications, Part 6. Consciousness only. In our previous discussion of emptiness, we explored how, as the disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha organized and classified his teachings, they came to consider several fundamental constituents of the universe as existing entities. However, such theories of existence were seen as contradicting the middle way and the teaching of no self by Shakyamuni. Therefore, scholars such as Nāgārjuna and Nāgārjuna's followers systematically rejected these theories of existence and asserted that everything is ultimately empty, as explained in the previous chapter. However, despite everything being ultimately empty and non-existent, the cycle of delusion of individual entities, as elucidated by Shakyamuni Buddha, through the 12 dependent originations, continues to manifest. As explained earlier, this cycle of delusion persists until one fully comprehends the middle way. Nāgārjuna and his followers, who expounded on emptiness, later formed the philosophical school, known as the Madhyamika, engaging in debates with proponents of substantial existence, like those from the Sarvastivadin school. However, due to the emphasis on refuting theories of existence in these debates, some people developed a nihilistic impression that nothing truly exists, and upon enlightenment, all phenomena dissolve into nothingness. In response to such concerns, emerged the proponents of the Yogacara, also known as the consciousness-only school. The primary figure associated with the foundation of this Yogacara school is said to be the renowned Bodhisattva Maitreya. Though Maitreya Bodhisattva, as a historical figure, is not documented, it is believed that a person named Asanga met Maitreya Bodhisattva in the heavenly realm of Tusita, through meditation, received teachings, and later recorded them. Some contemporary scholars argue that Asanga is essentially the founder of the Yogacara school. However, the disparity in writing style between Asanga's records of Maitriya's teachings and his works leads some to speculate that there might have been another founder of the Yogacara school, distinct from Maitreya Bodhisattva of Tusita. Regardless, the Yogacara school, also known as the Vijñanavada, was known for its focus on meditation practice. Unlike the Madhyamika, they didn't dwell solely on the concept of emptiness, but actively sought to explain how phenomena, even if ultimately non-existent, manifest based on our daily experiences. According to the Yogacara school, each individual is composed of 8 consciousnesses. Initially, the 5 sensory consciousnesses correspond to the 5 senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, known as the 5 sensory consciousnesses. Then there is the 6th consciousness, which synthesizes these sensory inputs into perceptions through language, known as consciousness. The sensory consciousnesses do not merely perceive external information, but project internal sensory information outwardly. For example, the eye consciousness projects various visual perceptions inwardly, and recognizes them as external objects or landscapes. Similarly, the ear consciousness projects various sounds inwardly, and recognizes them as external sounds. The other sensory consciousnesses, nose, tongue, and body, function similarly. Beyond these 6 consciousnesses lies the Alaya Vijnana, or store consciousness, often likened to a hard drive in a computer, where all data is stored. However, unlike a passive data bank, the information stored in the store consciousness continually springs forth, giving rise to the 6 consciousnesses mentioned earlier. Additionally, at the root of these 6 consciousnesses, that are based on the store consciousness, there arises the 7th consciousness, known as the manas or mental consciousness, which perpetuates the illusion of self, based on the store consciousness. The manas consciousness, arising from the store consciousness, reinforces the notion of self, and drives actions aimed at maintaining this self. It serves as the source of all selfish thoughts and behaviors. In this sense, recognizing the middle way, and the teaching of no self by Shakyamuni Buddha, and persisting in the altruistic bodhisattva path, can be seen as a way to overcome the selfish influence of the manas consciousness. Thus, humans are said to arise from these 8 consciousnesses: the 5 sensory consciousnesses, consciousness itself, the manas consciousness, and the store consciousness. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into how this mechanism works. The store consciousness contains memories of all actions one has undertaken in the past. It stores memories of both selfish and altruistic thoughts and actions, as well as those in between. When one is reborn and a new life begins, the store consciousness utilizes accumulated data from the past to establish the environmental settings for the new life. It's crucial to understand that, in Buddhism, the concept of karma refers to the memories of past thoughts and actions stored in the store consciousness. These memories only serve to set the environmental settings for the new life. Therefore, even if one has engaged in numerous misdeeds in the past, it doesn't mean they will necessarily be reborn as a villain in the next life. However, the consequences of past selfish actions may manifest in the form of unfavorable environmental settings, leading to experiences such as being bullied. Yet, within such circumstances, if one reflects on their past deeds, maintains a sense of remorse, and refrains from seeking revenge, continuously expressing remorse and performing good deeds known as repentance in Buddhism, the records of thoughts and actions in the store consciousness for the present life will be predominantly positive. Consequently, the environmental settings for the next life will be very positive, surrounded by kind and altruistic individuals. In summary, based on memories stored in the store consciousness, the environmental settings for a new life are established. Then, one's new thoughts and actions within these settings are recorded in the store consciousness moment by moment, shaping the environmental settings for the subsequent life. Therefore, regardless of whether one is born into a privileged environment or not, failing to express gratitude and engaging in selfish behavior will result in a future filled with hardship. Conversely, even if one is born into the worst circumstances, consistently expressing gratitude and remorse and engaging in altruistic actions will lead to improvement in one's situation. Thus, one's current circumstances and environment are entirely determined by one's past actions, making it a realm of absolute self-responsibility. However, while everything is indeed subject to individual responsibility, it should not serve as a reason to shirk responsibility onto others. Even if someone finds themselves in dire circumstances, due to their past actions, it's essential to offer assistance to those in need, as mutual aid leads to better lives for all. Since no one starts as inherently strong, mutual assistance is necessary for overcoming individual problems, and therein lies the origin of altruistic conduct. In this sense, the term self-responsibility, often heard nowadays, is often misused as justification for not helping those in need. However, such usage reflects the selfish nature of those individuals, who will undoubtedly realize the cruelty of such an attitude, when they themselves drop into such conditions. Therefore, although often misunderstood as fatalism, the concept of karma in Buddhism does not imply a predetermined fate. Rather, it emphasizes that, while broad environmental settings are established, one's freedom of action within these settings is guaranteed, representing absolute freedom. What is Buddhism? Applications. Part 7. The Six Perfections. The Six Perfections can be said to be the practice themes that Bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism should master. The term, perfection, in the Six Perfections comes from the paramita in Sanskrit, ancient Indian language, meaning completion, perfection, and reaching the other shore. So what are the six paramitas that refer to the perfection of six deeds or mental states? 1. Dana paramita equals perfection of giving, sharing, not being attached to possessions. 2. Sila paramita equals perfection of self-discipline. 3. Khasanti paramita equals perfection of not minding, being transcendent. 4. Virya paramita equals perfection of making effort. 5. Dana paramita equals perfection of focusing. 6. Prajna paramita equals perfection of wisdom, seeing things as they are from the middle way. However, it may be difficult to understand what is actually meant by the words perfection, or reaching the other shore, but since Mahayana Buddhism is based on the teachings of the Buddha, it will be easier to understand if we recall the basic teachings of the Buddha. In fact, Nāgārjuna, who elaborated the theory of emptiness, wrote his main work not on emptiness, but on the middle way. In other words, he reiterated the conclusions drawn from the Buddha's teaching on the middle way, using the term emptiness. Therefore, we can also reinterpret the term perfection as reaching the state of the middle way. As I mentioned in the section on the middle way, it means reaching a state beyond the binary oppositions such as self and others, overcoming the dichotomy of subject and object. If one can truly transcend the dichotomy of self and others, one can become a state of sharing everything with others in the true sense, without being attached to oneself or one's belongings. That is Dana paramita, which means the perfection of giving, sharing, not being attached to possessions. If one's attachment to oneself disappears, one will not be swayed by one's desires in the true sense. That is Sila paramita, which means perfection of self-discipline. If one's attachment to oneself disappears, one can remain transcendent in any situation. That is Khasanti paramita, which means perfection of not minding, being transcendent. If one's attachment to oneself disappears, one will not even think of being lazy. That is Virya paramita, which means perfection of making effort. If one's attachment to oneself and the desires arising from it disappear, the cause of mental disturbance disappears, and perfect concentration becomes possible naturally. That is Dana paramita, which means the perfection of focusing. If one can reach the state of the perfect middle way, beyond the dichotomy of self and others, one naturally possesses the wisdom to see things as they are. That is Prajna paramita, which means the perfection of wisdom, seeing things as they are from the middle way. Ultimately, if one can reach the state of the perfect middle way beyond the dichotomy of self and others, then naturally, the wisdom to see things as they are is acquired and the perfection of wisdom is achieved. At the same time, the other 5 perfections are also achieved simultaneously. Therefore, the six perfections are not something that can be achieved one by one in order. If one cannot reach the state of the perfect middle way beyond the dichotomy of self and others, none of the perfections can be achieved. Conversely, if one can reach the state of the perfect middle way, then all six perfections will be achieved simultaneously. In addition, in order to attain such a perfect state of the middle way, if one can go beyond such a state of separation of self and others, and attain the perfect state of the middle way, in the process of mastering any one of the six paramitas, then the other five paramitas can also be attained at one stroke. In this sense, the six perfections are assumed to lead to the state of the perfect middle way, which overlaps with the Eightfold Path, introduced earlier in this series. Among the Eightfold Path, right speech, right action, and right livelihood correspond to perfection of self-discipline. Right mindfulness and right concentration correspond to the perfection of focusing. Right view and right thought correspond to perfection of wisdom, seeing things as they are from the middle way. Right effort corresponds to perfection of making effort. Adding the perfection of giving, sharing, and not being attached to possessions and the perfection of not minding and being transcendent, we have the six perfections. Initially, the Eightfold Path was essential for becoming an arhat, but for bodhisattvas who seek to walk the path of Buddhahood along with others in society, attitudes of giving, sharing, and not being attached to possessions become crucial in their relationships with themselves and others. It also becomes indispensable for a bodhisattva to develop a mindset of not minding and being transcendent in any kind of defamation or slander in society. In this way, the six perfections seem to have begun to be emphasized, along with the ideal of bodhisattva practice in Mahayana Buddhism. It is said that a sutra older than the Prajnaparamita Sutra, called the Six Perfections Sutra, existed around 150 BC. It can be said that the Prajnaparamita Sutras are scriptures that emphasize the importance of Prajnaparamita in particular, out of the six paramitas that were initially taught in parallel. This means that by the time the Prajnaparamita Sutras were compiled, the concept of the six paramitas had already spread to some extent, and it seems that the emphasis on Prajnaparamita was based on this premise. However, when the Lotus Sutra appeared, within it, there are descriptions that those who expound the Lotus Sutra naturally fulfill the six perfections. In short, as I mentioned earlier, those who are trying to walk the path of enlightenment with others through the Lotus Sutra will come to wish for the happiness, awareness, and enlightenment of others as if they were themselves, and they will naturally come to a state of mind that transcends the distinction between self and others, in other words, a state of mind like the middle way itself. And when they realize this, the six paramitas will be fulfilled naturally. However, ordinarily, such a mindset lasts only for a moment, and in the next moment, one returns to a mindset of self-centeredness. That is what distinguishes ordinary beings from those who have completely achieved such a mindset. In other words, the difference between a Buddha and a Bodhisattva on the path is that while the Buddha's realization is complete, the Bodhisattva's realization is temporary. However, even for such a Bodhisattva on the path, if one can reach a mindset where the dichotomy of self and others is forgotten many times, it is certain that one will gradually become closer to the mindset of a Buddha. Perhaps therein lies the meaning of continuing the practice of the Bodhisattva. What is Buddhism? Applications, Part 8. The Buddha is not the creator of the universe, nor is he the great life of the universe. I previously introduced an analogy about waves. This analogy was meant to simplify the narrative but contained elements that could lead to significant misunderstandings from a Buddhist perspective. Suppose a wave in the ocean becomes aware that it is a wave. By becoming aware that it is a wave, it comes to regard many other waves as its rivals, and it spends all its time competing with them for survival. In other words, a delusion arises that it and others are in competition with each other. This delusion is the cause of all suffering. However, when it realizes that it is not just a wave, but the entire ocean, the delusion of self-other conflict disappears, and it experiences a sense of oneness with the entire ocean, comparable to the enlightenment of Buddha. However, what could be misleading was that the real self that finally arrived was the ocean itself, the great ocean. The reason is that, although a metaphor, the actual ocean is a real thing, an object of perception. As explained in the doctrine of the 12 dependent originations, phenomena such as sensation, consciousness, etc., all lack inherent existence, and are not based on any concrete entity. In Buddhism, everything is considered to be a product of delusion, and this delusion perpetuates itself by generating further delusions, rather than misunderstanding some inherently existing reality. Upon realizing the true nature of things, and eliminating fundamental ignorance, all subsequent fabrications are believed to completely dissipate. However, the recognition subject that remains, after all delusions have disappeared, is, of course, not identical with any object of perception. This is an important premise of Buddhist teaching. Therefore, it is a contradiction to the basic premise of Buddhism to identify the recognition subject, which has reached the state of perfect middle way, with the object of perception, such as the ocean, the world, the universe, or cosmic life. In other words, the state of transcendence, in which the recognition subject does not identify itself with any object of perception, is called the state of the middle way. Therefore, when the recognition subject identifies itself with some concrete existence, it can no longer be said to be in the state of the middle way. This is why we cannot identify the Buddha, who has reached the perfect state of the middle way, with any other concrete existence. Nevertheless, as time went by, the idea that everyone has the potential to become a Buddha came to be interpreted in a pantheistic way, and the theory that everyone is a manifestation of the Buddha himself, but is simply unaware of it, emerged. That is to say that, the concept that originally meant the possibility of becoming a Buddha, came to be thought of as the result of the Buddha himself being a great life, with substance as the main body of the universe, and all beings, including people, being manifestations of that cosmic great life. There is a fundamental difference between respecting all living beings as equal to the Buddha, and regarding all beings as literal manifestations of the Buddha. Respecting all living beings as equal to the Buddha is extremely important, and an essential perspective for a Bodhisattva, yet, to regard all living beings as literal manifestations of the Buddha, is to say that the entire delusional world was created by the Buddha. To begin with, the Buddha is not the creator. The Buddha is a being who transcends the world of delusion, but as a Tathagata, continues to help suffering sentient beings to awaken and escape from the world of delusion. In the Buddhist worldview, there is no creator of this delusional world, or great life in the universe. This is because the world of delusion is a world chosen and determined by our own consciousness, from among the myriad of coexisting possibilities. Moreover, likening the Buddha to life itself confounds the essence of both life and the Buddha. The essence of life lies in metabolism, which includes utilizing other beings for the survival of individuals and the collective, species. The source of human selfishness seems to be a trait inherent in life. Life is destined to sacrifice others, in order to maintain its own survival. No matter how much we wish for the happiness of others, the essence of life is to try to survive only for ourselves, even if it means taking their lives. Fundamentally, such fatalistic selfishness of life has its source in the delusion of separation of self and others, but Buddhism teaches the way to overcome such fatalistic selfishness. It is the Bodhisattva practice as mentioned earlier. By continuing to strive to give priority to the happiness of others, we can gradually weaken the influence of selfishness in life and, more essentially, the formative force to separate oneself from others. Ultimately, by transcending such delusions of self-preservation, one can reach a sense of oneness with all beings and approach the enlightenment of the Buddha. As mentioned above, the Buddha leads us out of a world of struggle and suffering, to a world without conflict and sorrow. Therefore, comparing the Buddha to the cosmic life itself, which created this world, is like comparing a fireman to an arsonist. Exposing the merciless nature of life activities and presenting it starkly, Kenji Miyazawa, a gifted Japanese writer of children's stories and devotee of the Lotus Sutra, brilliantly depicted the essence of Buddhist thought in his masterpieces. Among them is a short story called The Nighthawk Star. The main character, the Nighthawk, has a heart of compassion for others, but must kill and eat them to survive. The story goes that he is so distressed by this fundamental contradiction that he eventually transcends his existence as a living being to stop eating others, flying into the distant sky to become a star in the night sky. In this sense, Kenji Miyazawa is one of the few individuals among contemporary Buddhists who truly understood the thought of the Buddha. As already mentioned, considering the basic premise of Buddhism that the world is a choice made by each individual mind, it is no exaggeration to say that the idea that everything in the world is a manifestation of the Buddha is not a Buddhist concept at all. Moreover, there are countless options for the world that each one of us can perceive, and at each moment, each one of us chooses one world out of countless possibilities based on our own mental state and memories of past actions. Thus, not all humans share the same future or past. The world chosen by a selfish and hostile person will be a world of conflict and strife, and may even lead to the extinction of the human race. Conversely, the world chosen by those who consistently wish for and act for the well-being of others may be a world of peace and harmony, where people cooperate with one another toward enlightenment. In Chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra, there is an expression, even when sentient beings see that the time of the end of the world has come and everything will be burned up, I see this world at peace and filled with heavenly deities and human beings. This means that even if many people think that the end of the world is coming and everything will burn up, the world as the Buddha sees it will continue to be peaceful and filled with pure-hearted living beings. This does not mean that the world in which the Buddha resides is a separate world from this world, but rather that the world seen by those who are delusional and the world seen by those who have a mind like the Buddha are two parallel worlds that are superimposed on each other. In other words, the peaceful world as seen by the Buddha and the world in which humanity is destroyed by a great fire are both possible choices, and until each person's mind actually chooses and determines the choice, they are parallel worlds that coexist. Therefore, whatever the world may be, we should never forget that it is not a world created by the Buddha, but a world chosen by our own mind. What is Buddhism? Applications. Part 9. The origin of suffering and the necessity of Bodhisattva practices. In the previous chapter of Applications 8, I briefly touched upon why I believe Kenji Miyazawa deeply understood the true essence of Buddha's teachings. Furthermore, in Applications Part 3, I mentioned briefly why one needs to practice the path of a Bodhisattva to become a Buddha and why it requires an incredibly long period. Now, I'd like to explore these topics further. Firstly, let's examine the nature of suffering. This time, I'd like to offer a more in-depth analysis than a general explanation. Humans undeniably possess a sense of compassion towards other beings. However, in contradiction to this sentiment, to sustain the existence of self, one inevitably sacrifices others constantly. Even if one feels sorry for chickens, pigs, or cows, to sustain self, one must sacrifice them. Even in the case of vegetarianism, crops like rice and beans are originally meant for their descendants, yet humans usurp them, essentially sacrificing these beings. No matter how much one speaks of love, compassion, or empathy, people readily sacrifice other living beings without hesitation, citing hunger before their words about compassion have even dried up. If one were to say that those who fail to recognize this are simply insensitive, audacious, hypocritical, and selfish without empathy towards others, I doubt anyone would disagree. If there were truly compassion towards others, one would immediately notice this fact, and for those who realize it, this fundamental contradiction should be nothing but unbearable suffering with no escape. And this suffering is proportional to the degree of compassion towards others. Those with maximum compassion should experience the greatest suffering. Those with no compassion should experience no suffering at all and can selfishly enjoy their happiness shamelessly. The origin of suffering in Buddhism lies precisely in this fundamental contradiction, and to talk about the cause of suffering without addressing this fundamental contradiction is merely a skillful means to make it understandable even to those lacking such sensitivity. The essence of life's suffering lies in the inherent contradiction between the desire for self-preservation and the feeling of compassion for others. These two conflicting notions perpetually clash, leading to existential anguish. Only by recognizing this perpetual conflict can we truly grasp the fundamental suffering from which there is no escape. The relationship between desire and suffering in Buddhism is not a story of luxurious choices made by idle individuals solely seeking peace of mind, as commonly misunderstood. It is rather a path walked by those who keenly feel the fundamental contradiction and the unbearable suffering that comes with it due to their compassion towards others, and sincerely wish to address that state. It is our duty as conscious beings to be aware of such things. And aside from those who are insensitive, bold, hypocritical, unsympathetic, and selfish, all compassionate people have no other choice but to face such facts with sincerity and consider how they can live without further sacrificing others. What kind of way of life does Buddhism suggest? The ordinary state before entering the Buddhist path is, as mentioned above, a state in which one continues to sacrifice others for the sake of self-preservation. As long as this state persists, one must continue to suffer from the fundamental contradiction between this fact and the human emotion of compassion for others. Trying to avoid this suffering, even if one try to stop living, unfortunately, as long as the delusion of self exists, one will be reborn into this world again due to the formative force of samskara created by primordial ignorance, which is the fundamental cause of delusion, repeating the same acts of sacrificing others. Therefore, as long as the delusion of self exists, even if one tries to stop living, it will not lead to any resolution. However, this delusion of self was not formed overnight, but has been accumulated and strengthened by countless selfish acts that have been repeated for self-preservation from the beginning of evolution, as a primitive being through reincarnation to the present. Therefore, in order to neutralize such energy for self-preservation, one must repay all the debts accumulated through countless past selfish acts, and the indebtedness of the vast number of others sacrificed. In other words, the balance between the accumulation of selfish karma and the accumulation of altruistic karma must be reduced to zero. To do so, we must accumulate as many or more altruistic acts as the number of beings sacrificed to us in the course of evolution. Altruistic acts refer to contributing to the enlightenment and happiness of others, in order to repay a debt from the past. This is the Bodhisattva practice, and only those who have completed this practice can become Buddhas. Since the number of beings to whom we must repay our debts is enormous, we must spend a great deal of time performing altruistic deeds to achieve this. That is why it is said that the Bodhisattva practice takes an enormous amount of time, and no one has ever become a Buddha, no matter how long they continue to meditate in the same way as the Buddha. As I have already mentioned many times, in order to become a Buddha, it is necessary to be at peace in the perfect state of the middle way. After that, in order to continue to lead sentient beings to the state of enlightenment as a Tathagata, it is necessary to have unlimited compassion for others. To do so, one's altruism toward others must far outweigh one's attachment to oneself. Otherwise, one's selfishness will outweigh one's altruism toward others, and one will not be able to continue to practice altruism. While it is relatively easy to remove attachment to self, as in the practice of becoming an arhat, it is incomparably more difficult to continue the endless practice of altruism toward an infinite number of others. To make this possible, as a bodhisattva, one needs to accumulate altruistic deeds that far exceed one's selfishness. That is why there are many people who have become arhats, but no one has ever become a Buddha except for Sakyamuni Buddha. That is how difficult and time-consuming the bodhisattva practice is. However, Mahayana Buddhism may be trying to tell us that the best way to live as a human being is to live for the happiness of others while aiming for such an ideal image, rather than aiming to actually become a Buddha or a Tathagata one day. In reality, it is said that in the process of bodhisattva practice, by cultivating compassion for others and manifesting it in action, one gradually becomes aware of self and others, without distinction, comes to feel the joys and sufferings of others as one's own, and eventually attains a sense of happiness that transcends distinctions between self and others. The final goal of becoming a Buddha is to be completely liberated from the delusion of self, and to reach a state of complete transcendence from the delusional world, yet as a Tathagata, descends to the delusional world again, and become one with all beings, in which unlimited and perfect compassion is realized. Buddhism is the path to ultimately attain such perfect compassion. So, what are some practical ways we can live our daily lives, in order to come as close as possible to such a final goal of Buddhism? What is Buddhism? Applications. Final chapter. What is the ideal Buddhist way of life? In light of what has been discussed in this series, what exactly constitutes the ideal way of life? Here is a summary of the main points. 1. As a follower of the Buddha's teachings, contribute to the well-being of all living beings, and take action to spread awareness that it is the duty of all humankind to ensure that all living beings are free from suffering and able to live in peace. 2. As an advocate of the Buddhist Bodhisattva way of life, personally practice the principle of valuing others as much as oneself, and strive to expand the circle of empathy, so that it becomes a common principle for all mankind. 3. Recognize that all the events we experience in our daily lives reflect the accumulation of our own actions from the past. Strive to improve the totality of our accumulated actions, by realizing their meaning for the present conditions, and improving our actions and way of thinking, especially toward others. 4. Understand deeply the Buddhist principle of dependent originations, and live in a way that contributes to the well-being of all beings with whom we interact, realizing that nothing we experience is unrelated to us. 5. In daily interactions with others, always try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, and make an effort to understand their thoughts and feelings, rather than being caught up in our own viewpoints. Think about what we can do to contribute to their happiness. 6. Recognizing that we are kept alive by an infinite number of connections, both in the flow of time and in the expanse of space, try to live in a way that allows us to appreciate and give back to each of these connections. 7. Keep in mind that although Buddhist scriptures are fundamentally for the study of the Buddha's teachings, they are ultimately for the realization of all that we are. When we recite the sutras, do so while being aware of the distance between their contents and our current state of mind. Strive to become aware of areas for self-improvement, and share such awareness with the people around us. 8. By reading and reciting the Buddhist scriptures, and sharing what we have realized with those around us, our awareness can become a catalyst for others to achieve their own awareness. When that person shares their awareness with others, it may trigger the awareness of many more people. In this way, the chain of awareness is expected to spread infinitely in Mahayana Buddhism. 9. The root of all evils that threaten the peaceful existence of human beings and other living beings, causing suffering and sorrow, is human greed, selfishness, hatred, envy, vanity, self-righteousness, and other follies. Buddhism teaches the way to eliminate these vices from their roots. Therefore, to eliminate all misery and sorrow in this world, all mankind can learn from Buddhism how to eliminate our own vices by becoming aware of our foolishness, and humbly reflecting on it. We, as followers of the Buddha's teachings, should be aware of our mission to make this known to all mankind. 10. Over the years, superstitions, unscientific beliefs, misunderstandings, and assumptions have led to unfortunate conflicts and great sacrifices. However, Buddhist knowledge is so useful to everyone that modern science often validates its teachings. In this sense, we should be aware that Buddhism can be an indispensable guideline for the future of humanity, regardless of ideological or religious differences, and we should make this fact known to the world. These points outline the ideal way of life for a follower of Buddhist teachings. It is hoped that these guidelines and goals will be embodied in concrete actions, through the efforts and wisdom of each of us, and that the circle of such actions will expand to all humankind. I would like to conclude this series by emphasizing once again that it is up to each of us to make the most of the wisdom of Buddhism. Thank you very much for following along until the end.